Queen's Gambit Accepted isn't very common these days, so most players don't really prepare for it. And when it suddenly shows up on the board, that's usually when the problems begin. I remember when I was younger, I used to play knight c3, thinking I was stopping b5 and developing like in the normal Queen's Gambit. And I'm clearly not the only one, because the databases show that most players do exactly the same thing. The funny part, that move is actually not good at all, and you're about to see why. Let's use a shortcut I really like when learning an opening. First we ask what's the best move in this position. Then we compare it to knight c3. According to master games, the best move is actually developing the other knight first. So what's the difference? Well, black can do something that either becomes possible because of knight c3 or something that knight f3 would have prevented. If we skip knight f3, one thing we don't prevent is black sacrificing the e-pawn with e5. The point of this move is to damage our castling rights and speed up black's development. Even though we win the pawn back, the resulting positions tend to favor black. A better approach is to ignore that pawn and simply play e3. After e takes d4 and e takes d, black cannot really hold the pawn on c4 with bishop e6 because of the d5 push. So white recaptures on c4 and transposes into a much better version of the exchange French. And here is how the same position occurs on the board, starting with indeed the French defense. In the end, black does not really gain much from this e5 idea, but it's still a useful motif to remember. Now let's look at another way black can try to punish white for developing the knight to c3 too early. It starts with a6. The idea is to prepare b5 to support the extra pawn, while the light square bishop gains access to a long central diagonal. Let's see what happens if white plays the most logical move, a4, stopping black's plan. By the way, this is by far the most popular move in the Lee chess database. But here is the problem. Compared to one move earlier, the b3 square becomes weaker, and black immediately tries to exploit that by bringing the knight to a5. It starts with knight c6, and it comes with tempo because it hits the pawn on d4. Now if white plays d5, then knight a5 is excellent for black. The knight is eyeing b3, and from a5 it also helps defend the c4 pawn. If white plays e3 instead, black still goes knight a5, followed by knight f3 and knight f6. At this point white might try to attack the pawn with knight e5, but black calmly defends it with bishop e6. It looks a bit unusual, but it works. If white pushes e4, black simply plays knight d7. After the knight trade, yes, white has two central pawns, but it's still a pawn down, and the b3 square is a huge weakness. And this is the moment where you can really see the problem with developing the knight to c3 in the Queen's Gambit Accepted. From that square, it cannot attack the pawn on c4 at all. If it were still on b1, it could jump to a3 or d2 in some positions and actually help win the pawn back. So far we've seen two key drawbacks. First, white does not control the e5 square because knight f3 hasn't been played. And second, the knight on c3 cannot help recapture the c4 pawn. Now let's look at the third reason against knight c3. In this position, instead of the modest e3, white can go knight f3, planning to push e4 next. And once again there is this beautiful move e5. We do see the knight on f3 this time, but the idea still works. In this case, the best option for white is simply to accept the sacrifice, trade queens, and try to equalize later in the endgame. But if white gets ambitious and pushes d5, thinking the e5 pawn will fall, for example after knight a5, knight takes e5, black calmly develops the bishop and brings the knight out. Just a few moves later, after rook e8, the pawn on e4 starts looking weak. White can defend it with knight e2, but then comes bishop d7, preparing b5 and threatening b4, putting the e4 pawn in danger. Here we see that the knight on c3 not only fails to put pressure on c4, it actually becomes a target itself, threatened by the b pawn. The same problem shows up in another line, right after knight c3 and a6. If white plays e3, black responds with b5. White has to challenge those pawns immediately, otherwise they are simply a pawn down. But then comes the clearest argument against knight c3, b4. The extra pawn won't last, but the main point is that black gains several free moves while the white knight moves back home. After bishop b7 and knight f3, black strikes with c5. The idea is to create an isolated queen's pawn in white's camp and then continue developing normally. Knight f6, e6, bishop e7, castle, knight c6, and again knight a5. Trading pieces generally favors the side playing against the IQP. And here, black has no real problems at all. So, to summarize without memorizing a single line, the knight on c3 does not control the e5 square, which allows black to strike with e5, sometimes even as a pawn sacrifice. The same knight cannot help recapture the c4 pawn. And finally, it can become a target of the b5-b4 push, losing time and flexibility. That's why instead of knight c3, white should play knight f3, and then continue naturally with e3 and bishop takes c4. If this was helpful, feel free to share the video or drop a comment.